Hi everyone, welcome to week 3. We're going to review verbs this week. So we'll kind of go over verbs in general, then look specifically at indicatives and infinitives, which are the verb forms you learned last year. Okay, if you remember, Latin verbs are divided into conjugations. You probably don't think of English verbs as having conjugations, and strictly speaking, they don't. But just like declensions are for nouns, conjugations are ways to organize the behavior of verbs. So if you look here at this little chart, if we divided verbs into patterns of behavior, we might have a category for verbs that add a D or an ED to make the past tense, a separate category, and again, categories like conjugation, for verbs that change the vowel, so run, ran, ring, rang, etc. All right, and then a third category for verbs that kind of change their spelling altogether. So see, saw, take, took, etc. So this is what conjugations do. They organize the behavior of verbs. So first conjugation verbs behave a certain way, second conjugation verbs behave another way, etc. All right. So as you might remember, Latin has 4 conjugations: first, second, third, fourth. There is this third IO conjugation, which is a little bit of an asterisk. It is essentially a fourth conjugation verb, or at least it behaves as a fourth conjugation verb. But it has a third conjugation infinitive, and that's why it's considered, by definition, a third conjugation verb. Remember that we identify conjugation by the second principal part, or the infinitive of the verb. All right, the second principal part is the present active infinitive, so those are there. You might note that the second, the third, and the third IO all have ERE for their infinitive. Second is technically a long ERE, and you can see that long mark there. But the best way to distinguish among those three is to then go to the first principal part. So if you have an ERE infinitive, the way to tell them apart is the first principal part. Second conjugation will have EO. Third will have plain old O. Third IO will have IO. All right, so that's your best bet for telling apart those ERE infinitives. Okay, so for the present, the imperfect, and the future here, you use the second principal part of the verb. That's that ERE form, or RE form, I should say. They're not all ERE. Minus the RE, that gives you the present stem, and that's elaborated here. Onto that present stem, you add the personal endings, and those are here. All right. So if we use the example, all right, of dokeo, dokera. All right. Oh, there it is. So there's dokera, the infinitive. We take off the RE, we get the present stem. All right. Then onto that present stem, we add these endings over here on the left. So let's say I wanted to say we teach. I'd use the mus ending onto that present stem, and we'd end up with doke mus, we teach. All right. And so the way the verb is divided, you have the stem. Oops, sorry about that. I'll just take that out. The stem, which is DOC. You have the characteristic vowel, which is E, and that is a highlight, all right. And then you have the ending, which is the mus, all right. So your verbs, or these personal forms, have 3 parts: the stem, the characteristic vowel, and then the ending. So the stem, of course, gives you the meaning. We know because of the DOC that it's from dokeo, dokera. The E kind of tells us the conjugation, sort of depends on the form, but serves as a transition between the stem and the ending. And then the ending, mus in this case, gives us the person and the number, or a little more simply, the pronoun, which is we. All right. So remember over here in the endings, each of these endings, the OST, mustis, und, and the aristor, mormini, untor, correspond to English pronouns, and those are elaborated here. All right. So it's pretty important that you know these endings and the pronouns that go with them. They're going to be sort of the basic endings for these 3 tenses: the present, the imperfect, and the future. All right. So lots of forms here. These are all the present tense verbs, or all the conjugations in their present tense verbs. The thing I want to remind you of is that these are all exactly the same, except for the characteristic vowel. So if you look kind of in the middle, A. We move over here to dokeo, E. All right, we move over here to pono, I, I. All right, copio, same thing. Audio, same thing. So all the endings are the same. The stems, of course, are going to change based on the verb. The only thing that really changes is the characteristic vowel. The good news is you really only need to keep those straight for when you're going English to Latin. When you're going Latin to English, when you're translating, the most important thing are those endings and knowing what pronoun those endings correspond to. I'll also remind you that the T ending, the T and the NT certainly can be a pronoun, he, she, it for the T, singular, or NT, they for the plural, but can also have nouns that go with them. So in other words, if I have something like magistri docent, all right, there's that NT ending, all right, so it's they, but magistri with that AE ending is a nominative plural. Excuse me. And so that's going to be the they that is reflected in the NT. So the teachers teach, and in this case, the female teachers, because of the AE feminine ending. So that is your present tense. All right. This is your imperfect. The formation is just the same. The important thing is to remember that this BA is the signal of the imperfect, and you can see it in all of these forms. Okay. So bam, bas, bot, bamas, badas, bont. Right? You can think of it that way, or you can think of it as exactly the same as the present, but just with a BA thrown in the middle. All right? So BA for all the imperfect forms, and that is what signifies the imperfect. The imperfect is generally translated were or was verbing. So I was carrying, portabam, portabamos, we were carrying. Can sometimes be translated with just the ED, we carried, something like that. That is a little more strictly speaking the perfect tense, but Latin will sometimes use the imperfect, where English will use a perfect. All right. This is the future. All right. So the future gets a little tricky just because you have this kind of dividing line, all right, whereby the first and second conjugation on the left, or the upper left there, use one formation, right, which is this bo, bis, bit, which you might remember. All right. So they use that BI for the future. All right. And then when you get into the third IO, and fourth, it does not use the BI. It uses an E, just a simple E. And you can see that here. Ponet, right? Ponemos, ponetis, ponent, etc. Third IO, or fourth, I should say, and third IO as well does the same thing, except it uses an IE. All right. And you can see those throughout. So same thing with the E, but it just adds an I in there because it's fourth and third IO. The single E for third conjugation especially is going to be a little tricky, and you need to watch out for it, because now we can have something like doquet, right? And there's that single E, or ponet, and there's that single E. Doquet is present, ponet is future. Doquet is present because it's a second conjugation verb, and we know that the E in second conjugation is present. Ponet is future because it's a third conjugation verb, and we know that the E for third conjugation is future. So there's no way to tell these forms apart except by knowing the vocabulary. That's the ambiguity that the third conjugation future introduces. All right. So one system for first and second conjugations, the bo, bis, bit. One system for third IO, and fourth, the ace, et. All right. Final thing I will point out is in the first and second conjugations, the I, when it hits an NT, changes to a U. So bunt instead of bint, and buntor instead of bintor. All right, and that actually occurs in the present as well, when third IO, and fourth use the I. All right, so now we're shifting to the perfect tense. All right, the previous tenses were the present, imperfect, and future. All right, and so those are going to be first and second principal parts. All right, give us the present, the imperfect, and the future. Perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect come from the third and fourth principal parts. Okay? The good news is every single verb will form itself the exact same way in these three tenses. And remember, we've already done these tenses here, so we're going to kind of shade those out as having already been done. Excuse me. we're focusing on the perfect, the pluperfect, and the future perfect now. We're shifting to the perfect tenses. All right. Every verb will form the exact same way. You take the third part, all right, and this is laid out here. So you take the third principal part, there it is of dokui. You take off the I and you're left with the perfect stem. All right. Excuse me, just to keep the subject the same, if I wanted to say we teach, dokui mus. All right. So as we did before with the present, there's my stem. All right. I guess technically speaking, there's my stem, including the U. All right. And then we go kind of right into the ending. There is no real characteristic vowel for these perfect endings because you'll note all the endings have a vowel built in, whereas with the present endings or the present stem endings, none of them begin with a vowel. All right, so perfect stem, third principal part minus the I, and then you add these endings down at bottom left. And again, that is the same for every verb, all conjugations, irregular verbs, the whole bit. The slightly tricky part is that oftentimes the stem, or I should say the principal part, the third principal part, will have a different stem from the first and second principal parts. So it's not so much memorizing the formation rules, it's knowing the vocab and what third principal parts belong to what verb. All right, so over here, you have the first conjugation done out in all of its forms, and then you have all the other conjugations plus irregular verbs done out down here. All right. The perfect tense is generally translated with the ed form of the verb. So cook, cooked, that's the perfect. The cooked part, run, ran, that's the perfect. The ran part. All right. So just to give you an example here, portawimus. Oh, let's get a better color there. Portawimus. All right. We carried. All right. So there's that ed form, which is the perfect. Okay. So this is the pluperfect. It is formed exactly the same way. Perfect stem, which is the third principal part minus the I. And then you add these endings here. Aram, aras, arat, aramus, aratus, arat. All right? And the pluperfect is translated had. Sometimes students will mix up had and has and have. Had is always the pluperfect and only the pluperfect. Has or have is the perfect. All right. Be careful though, because had, of course, can be a main verb, right? Like I had a good time. That's the past tense of to have, the verb to have. That's not the pluperfect. The had indicates the pluperfect when it is used as a helping verb, right? So I had run for 10 miles before I got tired. So had is the helping verb there with run. The pluperfect of the verb to have is actually two hads, right? I had a good time until I got tired. Had is the pluperfect of had. All right. As with before, on the bottom here, you have all conjugations plus irregular verbs done out in their pluperfect forms. But again, just like with the perfect, all verbs form the same way. It's the stem that often is different. All right. Same thing with the future perfect. Perfect stem, third principal part minus the I. Just a new set of endings, oro, oris, orit, orimus, oritus, orint. This is an orint, not an orunt. Normally you'd expect that I to change to a U before nt, but because the future perfect is relatively rare, they just keep the int. All right, the future perfect is translated will have, all right, and it indicates an action before another future action, or I should say a future action before another future action. So by tomorrow night, I will have studied for 5 hours, right? So there's that will have. Studying is in the future, but tomorrow night is more in the future, and that's why it's the future perfect. All right, same formation we've talked about, perfect stem plus the endings, and then here are all your verbs done out in the future perfect. All right, so let's shift over to infinitives. Infinitives are kind of a building block form. Generally speaking, in English, they're translated to verb, all right, or at least with to, and then the tense will change based on, or the verb part would change based on the tense of the infinitive. These are the present active and passive. As I said, the present active tends to be the second principal part. So you can see in this list here all those REs that we talked about. Not to mention some irregular verbs. No REs there, but that's why they are irregular. Okay, a couple REs in the irregular verbs. So the present active infinitive is translated to verb. All right. The present passive infinitive is essentially, instead of an RE, I should say, an RI. All right. The exception is third and third IO. Third and third IO take the whole ERE and replace it with an I. So it's not poneri, as you might expect, it's pony. It's not caperi, as you might expect, it's copy. You don't see the present passive infinitive too often, but when you do in this third conjugation, it can be tricky because that I ending can be so many other things. So you've got to watch out for it and be careful about it. All right. And the present passive infinitive is translated to be verbed. All right. I wore very loud clothing because I wanted to be seen, right? So there's my present passive infinitive. Most of the irregular verbs don't have passive forms. That's what the X's are for in the chart. Ferro, ferre does because it means to carry. All right, so that covers the verb form review. Let's take a look at this summatives. All right, so we are simply translating the verb forms into English. All right, remember that you want to watch out for things like tense signs. So in number 1, what does that BA tell you? All right, and you want to watch out for characteristic vowels. So number 2 and number 4 are both third conjugation verbs, but one has an I and one has an E, and that will indicate different tenses. Furthermore, number 5 is a second conjugation verb. It has an E, and that will indicate a different tense because it is a second conjugation verb rather than a third conjugation verb. Remember, you are allowed to use sort of glossaries and even grammars when doing this. You are not allowed to use translators. Okay, and then at the bottom, part B, you're translating sentences. All right, remember that they have to make sense in English. If they don't make sense in English, then they cannot be right. A good way to approach this is to read the sentence through. You can even read it out loud or read it in your head. So, herbs a reliquis kiwibus relicta erat. And as you're doing that, kind of make mental notes about things you notice. So, for instance, you might notice that herbs is a nominative, which as the first word is going to suggest that it's a subject. That a is a preposition, and it takes the ablative, and reliquis and kiwibus are ablative. So that is likely one unit, one prepositional phrase. And then that relicta erat is a verb, and that is going to be a pluperfect verb because of that erat. And then you take that information and you put it together. All right. The writing exam, again, you're going English to Latin, so same thing, but just the opposite direction. And remember that conjugation is going to be essential here. You're given the vocab here, so make sure to use it. I might even write down, even on a separate piece of paper, what conjugation each verb is just so that you can remember. All right. But remember, each conjugation is going to have a different formation for the present, the imperfect, and the future. Make sure you know what those are going to be before you get into it. And remember that for those present, imperfect, and future, you'll have a stem, a characteristic vowel, and an ending. Perfect tense will be a little more straightforward. It's just the third principal part minus the I plus the endings. But make sure you know those formulae and how to form those forms before you undertake this. All right, that's it for this week. Please email me with any questions, and there'll be a Q&A session in the e-session on Tuesday. Thanks.